Operation C, which the IJN had planned for early April, was designed to replicate the success of Pearl Harbor by surprising the Royal Navy and destroying the British Eastern Fleet in their home port of Colombo. What the Japanese didn't know was that, unlike Pearl Harbor, the Allies had by now partly broken their codes and were aware of the operation. The British reinforced their forces in Ceylon and prepared to set a trap. In a plan reminiscent of the Midway battle that would take place in a few months' time, the Royal Navy carrier force would lie in wait some 100 miles to the southwest of Ceylon, and when the Japanese were at their most vulnerable, they would coordinate a strike together with RAF forces on Ceylon to overwhelm and destroy the Japanese fleet. On paper, the British Eastern Fleet was a formidable force consisting of 3 carriers, 5 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 14 destroyers based out of Ceylon. A more thorough examination revealed significant limitations in this force. Of the 3 carriers, 2 were modern fleet carriers, HMS Formidable and HMS Indomitable, although they operated mostly obsolete aircraft compared to the Japanese. Between them, they had 45 Albacore torpedo bombers and 33 fighters. The 3rd carrier, HMS Hermes, was Britain's oldest and by now obsolete. By the outbreak of war, she had been relegated to a training ship, but was later recommissioned for frontline service. She could only carry 17 obsolete biplanes and was too slow to keep up with the other 2 carriers. 4 of the 5 battleships were of the slow Revenge class dating back to World War I. The only British battleship capable of keeping up with the 2 fleet carriers was HMS Warspite, an old but recently modernized battlecruiser. British fleet carriers' only advantage was armored flight decks and torpedo bomber squadrons trained for radar-assisted night attacks. Vice Admiral Somerville had taken command of the Eastern Fleet the previous month and was confronted with the problem of having a mix of modern and obsolete ships of varying speeds. The solution Somerville came up with was to split his fleet into a fast division by combining the 2 modern carriers with Warspite and a slow division with Hermes and the 4 obsolete battleships. Allied codebreakers identified only 2 carriers in the Japanese force, which they expected to attack Ceylon on April 1st. As a result, Somerville sailed early on March 30th from his base in the Maldives, anticipating an attack on April Fool's Day. As planned, Somerville placed his fleet in a patrol area 100 miles southwest of Ceylon, expecting to engage an enemy force of a similar size to his own, and conducted aerial reconnaissance in the area where the Japanese were anticipated to make their approach to strike Colombo. Ceylon's air defenses went on high alert, and Catalina reconnaissance planes were launched to locate the approaching enemy fleet. Unfortunately for Somerville, he had been let down by his intelligence services. No sign of Japanese ships had been detected by patrolling Catalinas or radio intercepts on the 1st or 2nd of April. Late on April 2nd, with some of his ships in need of resupply, Somerville concluded that, as was frequently the case, the intelligence had made a mistake. He detached Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers to resume previous commitments in the Bay of Bengal, while he returned the rest of the fleet to Adu Atoll in the Maldives. Ceylon's air defenses were stood down, but crucially, Catalina patrols continued. Although the intelligence proved mostly inaccurate, the Japanese were coming. With over 300 aircraft, Vice Admiral Nagumo's 5 powerful carriers, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, stormed into the Indian Ocean, accompanied by 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Only the Kaga was missing after suffering the indignity of running aground and having to return to Japan for repairs. After sweeping all before them in China and the Pacific, the carrier strike force, known in Japan as the Kido Butai, was at the peak of its combat power, having not yet suffered the disasters of Midway and Guadalcanal. Nagumo's task force was to launch a massive raid on Royal Navy bases in Ceylon, disrupt critical Indian Ocean convoy routes, and, most importantly, eliminate the British Eastern Fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's separate task force, consisting of the light carrier Rujo, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, collaborated with Nagumo by striking convoy routes in the Bay of Bengal. Late afternoon on April 4th, a Canadian Catalina flying boat spotted Nagumo's fleet 360 miles southeast of Ceylon. They had enough time to report the location, but not the size of the fleet before being shot down. Somerville had been caught in a bad tactical position, with the majority of his forces refueling 600 miles away at Adu Atoll, while Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers were in Ceylon. Somerville's fully fueled fleet sailed for Ceylon at dawn on April 5th, but it was too far away to impede the Japanese strike on Colombo. Having lost the element of surprise after being spotted the day before, the Japanese realized they would not find the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet tied up in port like the Americans were at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese sent in 91 dive bombers and 36 fighters, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had also spearheaded the Pearl Harbor attack. Due to delays in detecting the approaching strike, some hurricanes were still in the process of taking off when the first Japanese fighters swept in over Ratmalana Air Base. Just 7 Japanese aircraft failed to return to their carriers, while 20 of the 41 defending fighters that were able to get airborne were destroyed. Somerville, forewarned, took the precaution of dispersing the warships and merchant vessels gathered in Ceylon's harbors. The only Royal Navy ships left behind due to repairs were the destroyer Tenedos and the armed merchant Hector, both of which were sunk, along with a Norwegian merchant vessel. The Japanese bombers pounded Colombo, and while the explosions and fires looked spectacular, long-term damage was minimal. The heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall had fled Colombo during the night to join Somerville's fleet, which was rapidly approaching from the opposite direction. The pair were racing southwest when they were spotted at 10 in the morning by a spotter plane from the heavy cruiser Tone. Nagumo wanted those cruisers sunk, so he redirected 80 dive bombers intended for a planned second attack on Colombo to target the British ships instead. Dorsetshire and Cornwall were just 70 miles away from Somerville's large fleet when the Japanese bombers appeared overhead. HMS Dorsetshire sank within 8 minutes of the Japanese swooping in on the 2 heavy cruisers, leaving life rafts and wreckage behind. Meanwhile, HMS Cornwall fought back for 20 minutes before her stern rose high into the air and she slid to the bottom, her colors flying. Fuchida's assessment of the one-sided engagement was harsh.
The surface vessels did not have a chance against our striking force. It was so easy. Sea power has changed, and a new era has begun.
Somerville suspected he was up against more carriers than he had been led to believe based on signal intelligence and reports of the number of aircraft that had struck several targets. Mindful of the Admiralty's directive to minimize risk to his fleet, Somerville turned south to widen his distance from the enemy. His plan was to avoid the Japanese fleet during the day before closing in at night to strike with radar-equipped Albacore torpedo bombers. That night, radar-equipped aircraft were launched in an attempt to locate the Japanese fleet, but were unsuccessful due to Nagumo's decision to head in the opposite direction. Instead of capitalizing on his success in sinking the heavy cruisers by searching for the rest of the British fleet, Nagumo chose to circle back to the east of Ceylon in preparation for a strike on the naval base of Trincomalee. At naval headquarters, the Admiralty had now realized the magnitude of the naval force Somerville was up against, so they sent a signal to the battle fleet.
Get out of danger at the earliest moment.
Somerville decided to send the 4 old battleships to Mombasa, Kenya, while Warspite and the 2 fleet carriers would be stationed in Bombay, out of reach of Nagumo's carriers. After refueling at sea from his tankers, Nagumo struck again on April 9th, this time at Ceylon's other major port, Trincomalee. He dispatched 91 bombers and 38 fighters to attack the port. A Catalina sighting report of the Kido Butai's presence gave the British enough time to scatter shipping in the harbor and prepare for the incoming airstrike. After receiving ample warning, 17 Hurricanes and 6 Fulmars took position to contest the skies. They were able to shoot down 4 aircraft, but were soon overwhelmed by swarms of the faster and more agile Zeros, which shot down 9 of the defending fighters. The airbase and port were heavily damaged, though only 1 merchant ship was sunk in port. Later that morning, 9 unescorted Blenheim high-level bombers evaded the combat air patrol to launch a surprise attack on Nagumo's carriers. They scored no hits and were soon set upon by defending Zeros. Only 4 returned to base, all damaged, although they did shoot down 2 of the Zeros. As Nagumo prepared his aircraft for a second strike at Trincomalee, a sighting report from a reconnaissance plane flying 65 miles down the coast from Trincomalee came in. A small aircraft carrier with 2 escorts had been spotted about 5 miles offshore. Now that Nagumo had bigger fish to fry, the port strike was shelved, and soon 85 dive bombers with 9 escorting fighters were heading for the unfortunate ships. The carrier was Hermes and her escort, the Australian destroyer Vampire, accompanied by the hospital ship Vita. The Hermes had the distinction of being the world's first ship to be designed as an aircraft carrier in 1918 and was important in the development of carrier warfare. Now obsolete, she was slow, and due to having no fighters assigned, her only air defense was 3 antiquated AA guns. She was set upon by 45 Val dive bombers, which ripped her apart in less than 20 minutes. Although just as old, the Vampire had been modernized and had a far more formidable air defense. She managed to hit one of her 16 attackers before breaking in half and sinking 10 minutes after Hermes. The remaining bombers uncharacteristically observed the Geneva Convention and left the hospital ship to pick up survivors, electing to hunt for other prey up and down the coast instead. They found and sank a corvette and 3 merchants before retiring. Happy at bagging a carrier, Nagumo disengaged after recovering the strike and headed back to Japan. Japanese losses amounted to 18 aircraft destroyed. While Nagumo kept the Eastern Fleet busy, Ozawa's Malay force wreaked havoc off the Indian coast between Madras and Calcutta. In order to expand the coverage of his fleet, Ozawa divided his force into 3 separate groups. Fearing air raids, the Royal Navy decided to evacuate the ports and disperse the merchant fleet. This played into Ozawa's hand by increasing the number of targets out at sea. In just 3 days, Ozawa's force sank 23 merchant ships weighing more than 112,000 tons. The only saving grace for the British was that Somerville had kept the Eastern Fleet relatively intact thanks to Nagumo's inadequacy and some luck rather than good judgment. The British feared that Japan would exploit their victory by invading Ceylon to control the Bay of Bengal and conduct air operations over southern India. The raid demonstrated that if the Royal Navy were to challenge a Japanese carrier force, it would need to transfer most of its carriers from the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters where they were desperately needed. Within a few months, the U.S. Navy had solved the problem by destroying the Kido Butai at Midway and Guadalcanal. When 4 of the 6 fleet carriers the U.S. had started the war with were sunk, a grateful Royal Navy returned the favor by loaning the fleet carrier Robin. There are more great videos on my channel page. Check it out and press that bell icon so you don't miss the next video.